Hi, you're watching Bread and Roses, a weekly political social television magazine on New Channel TV. I'm Maryam Namazie and I'm presenting this week's program with my fantastic co-host Bahram Soroush.
Hello.
And Fariborz Pooya.
Hi.
In this week's program, we're going to be speaking about the extremely reactionary ISIS and the British connection, because I think that's quite an interesting issue that we need to discuss further. We'll also be interviewing Haras Rafiq, who is head of outreach for Quilliam Foundation, the anti-extremism think tank. Let's go to a small clip on this issue and we'll be back to discuss it further. The UK Home Office estimates that around 400 to 500 British people are currently fighting in Syria for ISIS. Fearing that they might be radicalised while fighting overseas, the Home Office has threatened to strip them of their passports. Last month, Prime Minister David Cameron warned that foreign fighters in ISIS posed the biggest threat to the UK. I think there's actually many reasons, and I don't know if any of you viewers out there agree with me, for why this is the situation, why there are over 500 British fighters fighting for ISIS. And I hate using the term fighters because they're terrorists. I think there's quite a few reasons for it, but one of them is definitely because a lot of the aspects of Islamism, like Sharia courts, like the burqa, like segregation at universities, they have been justified and legitimized here in Britain as people's right to religion, rather than seeing it as part of a larger Islamist plan to influence and get access in society and in various countries across the world. I don't know if either of you agree with me on this issue.
Yeah, I think it's not. This is not just limited to Britain.
Definitely.
About 4 weeks ago, the German Interior Minister and representative of the German Foreign Minister had a press conference exactly on the same issue, roughly the same numbers that from Germany actually been fighting within the ranks of ISIS. And this is the continuation of reproduction of the Islamism in Europe, and the root cause of it is actually tolerating right-wing Islamist movement in Europe. And we know, and we've been discussing this, in relation to multiculturalism and tolerating the unacceptable in society and compromising, thinking that if you allow these groups to function in Europe, you could control them. No, this is, as you said, is part of the global Islamist movement, and it needs to be challenged head on.
And one of the things, we've been seeing happening is that they make this distinction between jihadi groups and soft Islamist groups, groups like the Islamic Research and Education Academy. That defends stoning of women, that defends beheading of apostates, but they're the soft Islamists. They've got charity status, they can go to universities and impose sexual apartheid and so on and so forth. This distinction is really a false one, and I think we're seeing that more and more. A lot of these soft Islamist groups are actually creating they're normalizing the Islamist agenda and values.
If we look at what the root causes of this situation are, I think it could have been predicted, because for decades now, at least 3 decades now, you can see that there was this policy within the European governments especially of accommodating religion, and specifically Islamists, not just the extreme faction, because of course they would regard those as terrorists. They might threaten their own interests, but what they have done is to institutionalize and bring the institution of religion into this sort of civil society, which we believed in, say, in the 60s and 70s. People would talk about individuals, citizens, people with different political views. Now suddenly there was this talk about what are your religious affiliations, not seeing the unit of society as the individual and citizen, but seeing it as different religions, different strands of them, and trying to build this mosaic,
And so, in fact, in a sense, when we're talking about this, we can see that in addition, one of the other contributing factors is this sort of multiculturalism, multi-faithism, where people are no longer citizens. And it's something we discussed about Iraq as well. This is something that's been happening in many different countries, obviously to different degrees. But it's worrying because what it's done is it's homogenized entire groups and societies and handed them over to the Islamists because it seemed to be people's culture and religion, whereas clearly it's not.
And as a means of sort of controlling sections of the society, they think this is a solution. I mean, one thing that really I find it repulsive is for David Cameron and within the establishment, they don't mind if these people actually, what they're doing in Iraq and Syria, as long as they don't actually turn it into a threat within the European, sort of within home countries. And I think that's disgusting in a way. You know, the whole movement needs to be recognized as one, and there is no such thing as soft Islamists, and they need to be, as I said, they need to be challenged head on in Britain. And this is today in schools in Britain, in communities in Britain, they are being reproduced. And if the society is not prepared to actually challenge this, we're going to see a lot more of this in the future.
One of the things that also I find disturbing is not so much that they're only concerned about what happens in Syria and Iraq. As long as it happens there, it's fine. But also here, it's basically running minority communities on the cheap by handing them over to these reactionary, regressive Islamic organizations to run, you know, their own communities without having due course and legal rights in the same way that other citizens do. You know, and the only thing they're worried about is the bombing of an underground. But what about all the sort of threats and coercion that these Islamic groups are imposing right here in Britain? The amount of death threats that ex-Muslims and apostates get. Very simply, this group, Islamic Education and Research Academy, on Twitter, they've called me a monafiq, a mortad. They've called me janazeh, a play on my word, Namazie, which means corpse. They're basically threatening me, but they are a charity. And it's fine for them to do that as long as they're not putting bombs. What the government fails to see is the link between these soft groups and terrorism.
Absolutely. It's a sort of policy of ghettoization and isolating these so-called communities, attributing identities to people who never thought that they had, putting everyone, including, I'm sure, us, because of our names, on the statistics for Muslims, you know, saying there are so many millions in Britain. It's this policy which has allowed those self-appointed so-called community leaders to come and say that they are representative of that. And in the case of like this Trojan horse case in Birmingham, still they are not learning the lesson. What they are saying is, we are against the extremists. But so it is okay for girls to be segregated and for all this education to be fed into them inside their own girls' schools. It's only when it is a sort of supposed to be a community school that you are protesting against. And it is this policy, obviously, which was the breeding ground for the development of homegrown terrorism.
Definitely. Let's go now and see an interview with Haras Rafiq on this very issue and what his perspective on this sort of radicalization is, and then we'll be back to discuss it further. Stay with us. Hello, Haras Rafiq. Thank you for joining our program. I wanted to ask you about the whole thing that we're hearing in the news now of the large number of British foreign fighters in ISIS. What do you think is the reason behind these large numbers?
I think there's a number of reasons. We've had a growing phenomenon that is Islamism that's been growing in the UK certainly since the 1980s onwards, and I think that prior to that, most of the immigrants that came over here were social economic migrants. My parents came here in the 50s, my uncles in the 20s, and they came here really to provide a living for their families back in Pakistan or India or wherever. But in the 80s, we started to see a new generation or a new type of Muslim migrant that came to the UK, and that was the Islamist. And they were well motivated, they were dissidents from their own countries, many of them, and they were well funded by a number of Middle Eastern regimes that allowed them to spread a particular brand of Islam. And what happened is that along the way, the youngsters grew up in this country, and if we look at how somebody's recruited to this type of extremism or Salafi jihadism, it's usually a number of pathways. The most common one really, or the most common thing, is that most of these people have some form of personal crisis. And that personal crisis could be perceived or it could be actual. It could be racism, it could be that they can't get a job, or in the case of the guy who led the 7/7 bombers, said he can't, it was the fact that he didn't want to have an arranged marriage. And what recruiters do is they actually create, Islamist recruiters, they create this prism through which these individuals can be guided down a number of pathways. The first one is that they're taught that the answer to their problems and the solution to the problems really can only be effected if they create this caliphate, this Islamist caliphate, and rule through what they call an equitable Islamic version of Sharia. The second pathway is that they're taught that there is a theological justification to all of the things that they're doing, and that the only way they can be a Muslim is to practice this very narrow, contemporary Salafist version of Islam that actually alienates everybody else, and that anybody who doesn't practice Islam the way they do is either an apostate or a heretic, and they should be fought. And then there are a number of people with mental health issues and also people who perhaps have had some type of personal loss and want to go out and take revenge. And these factors and these pathways are very common, and unfortunately in Britain over the last sort of 20-30 years we've had this Islamist underbelly that's been growing within our society, and it's been well funded by many states in the Middle East.
So but there is also a link, I mean, internationally with this as a political movement. In a sense, there are many generations of people who have the same issues that you mentioned, who join progressive, left-wing sort of protest movements and political groups. In a sense, it is because of the fact that we have an international Islamist movement that it makes it easier for a lot of these young people, in a sense, to be guided towards it?
Oh, absolutely. The number of reasons. I mean, yes, we do have this international Islamist movement. You know, it's operating now. It has been doing from the Middle East and from parts of Southeast Asia. But one of the things that they've been able to do very well is get out to youngsters messages of recruitment in a manner that they actually want to be able to receive them. So, for example, 10 years ago, they were using emails and mobile phone text messages very, very effectively. Right now, they're using Google, Facebook, they're using Twitter, and they're using YouTube, and all of the social media ways of actually getting to people much more efficiently than we're doing, certainly in the counter-narrative side and certainly on the progressive side. So I think that the way and the strategies that they're using to get to youngsters is much more slicker, and we have a lot of catching up to do.
The thing is that there's often a lot of confusion between Muslims and Islamists. Oftentimes, Islamist values organizations are seen to be or recognized as the representatives of Muslims. In your opinion, what are the distinctions? Clearly, there are huge distinctions between the two. What are they, and what are the characteristics of an Islamist group or person?
Well, first of all, we have Islam, the faith, and we have Islamism, a political ideology. Just as we have social and socialism being two completely different words and two completely different aspects, parts, a spectrum of what they actually are. We have Islam, which is an individual faith and a relationship that one has between them and God. And we have Islamism, which essentially is an ideology but believes in three things. The first thing it believes in is that it has to set up, or somebody has to set up, an Islamic state, a caliphate, and govern that caliphate by their version of fiqh or their version of Sharia. And their version is very narrow, and it's anybody else who doesn't believe in the same things that they believe in is not the same as them. Second thing they want to do is they want to expand that state across the world. And if you imagine that, you know, somebody who wants to spread something forcibly, there's going to be an element of fighting. There's going to be a battle somewhere, because countries aren't going to lay over and say, "Oh, come on in, you know, welcome, come and govern us by your version of Islamic Sharia." And the third thing they want to do very clearly is wipe Israel off the face of the map. And that's why currently we're seeing a lot of Islamist organizations focusing on Israel, because it's an opium for the masses almost. It's a way to get Muslims angry. It's a way to lead them down particular pathways. And these three things are the most common things that all Islamist organizations in the world want to achieve.
Now, you know, you mentioned the fact that there are some reasons why Muslims are angry and so they join Islamism. I mean, for me, I find that a bit hard to buy in some instances because, you know, in many cases, it's not about the Palestinian issue, or it's not about a US invasion on Iraq. And in fact, many of these Islamist groups are killing more Muslims than anybody else, you know, or people considered Muslims. So I sort of feel like these are ways in which they're excuses as a way of recruiting people.
Yeah, absolutely. Foreign policy, if we look at foreign policy and we look at Iraq and Afghanistan, well, there was no Iraq and Afghanistan when 9/11 took place. It's very easy for people who don't quite understand what's going on. It's very easy for Islamists themselves to create an atmosphere whereby there are many other things that can be blamed as the root cause for making people go to a particular direction towards extremism and Salafi Jihadism or Islamism. The left does it very well. A lot of people do it very well, but they're not the root causes. The root causes are people are brainwashed into believing that the answers to their problems, whatever they may be, nobody essentially goes and blows themselves up because of Iraq, Afghanistan, or what's happening in Palestine and Israel. If you look at the videos that a lot of these guys make, yes, they will express that these are the things that made them angry, but at the end of it, they always say one thing, and one of the things is, may Allah accept our sacrifice. They have been brainwashed into believing that not only is it something that they have to do, but it's something God wants them to do. And that's the real problem. So when people move down this pathway, one of the 4 pathways, and they belong to a group, not everybody will actually go out and blow themselves up. Not everybody will go out and fight other Muslims and kill other Muslims. There'll be some people who will stay back as fundraisers. There'll be some people who will stay back as people who are recruiting others to their cause. But there will be a few that will go out and fight. But the others are just as dangerous as the ones that are actually going out and doing fighting.
I mean, that's an interesting point. Like groups like, let's say, the Islamic Education and Research Academy, what people consider soft Islamists, in a sense, they're calling for very violent things. They want a Khalifa as well, they want death for apostates, and so on and so forth. Where do you place them in all this?
Well, let's make, I don't make any distinction between them and Al-Qaeda, and I'll tell you why I don't make any distinction, because they believe in exactly the same things. They want to kill apostates, they want to, anybody who leaves the faith of Islam, they want to have the hudud punishments, they want all of the things that Al-Qaeda wants, and they believe all the things that Al-Qaeda wants. The only difference is that for them, it's not tactically, they're not ready from a tactical perspective to go out and fight right now. Secondly, some of these people are cowards. If they genuinely believe that they should be going out and supporting these things, why aren't they doing it? Why are they sitting in their very nice houses in London or wherever it is that they live, sitting back and thinking, you know what, yeah, we believe in the cause, but we're actually not going to go out and do anything. Part
of it could also be, it's the public relations aspect of it, isn't it? It's normalizing Islamist values.
Yeah, I mean, that's another aspect. If you look at IERA, one of the things they say in their propaganda is that they believe that they're doing dawah to propagate what they call normative Islam. And you're absolutely right that by actually making a lot of noise, by actually hijacking the microphone, by actually going into universities, by actually going into a number of places, they can make it seem, first of all, that that is the only real acceptable face of Islam. And secondly, yes, they are recruiting for their cause. And you know, I wonder how many people are actually out in joining with ISIS or somewhere else because of a radicalization process that's been started by groups such as IERA.
So do you see a link between, let's say, the rise in Sharia courts here in Britain to the gender segregation at universities, to groups like what IERA are doing, with the rise of what is called jihadism? Or
yeah, absolutely. One of the initial starting points of taking somebody down a pathway is to persuade them that the Islam or the faith that their parents practiced and their grandparents practiced, which didn't show a dichotomy between being British and Muslim or Pakistani and Muslim or Iranian and Muslim or whatever nationality and Muslim, is actually fits into, and the practices fit into one of 4 categories: bid'ah, haram, shirk and kufar. All the practices they believe, or many of the practices they believe, take people down a path that actually no longer makes them a Muslim. So these people, when they start bringing back, and I say bringing back very carefully, segregation, gender segregation, and wearing the niqab, because I never saw the niqab in the UK. I was born here, I'm 49 years of age. I never saw the niqab in the UK until I was about 18 or 19. And I lived in a Muslim area, I was brought up in a Muslim area. This Arabization, this Salafization of the Islam that the people from the Indian subcontinent, majority of Muslims in this country, brought over here, is a massive, massive tool that they use to actually start the process of taking somebody down this particular pathway.
How do you challenge all of this? I mean, some of the work that Quilliam's doing.
I think one of the things we notice is that people talk about lone wolf radicalization. People talk about people being radicalized in isolation. That's a lot of rubbish, and I'll tell you why that's a lot of rubbish. We recently did a report called Jihad Trending, where we analysed 30 jihadi websites, and there were a number of things that were debunked. One of the things was that there is no such thing as lone wolf terrorism. Every single person that goes down a path of extremism has to have some form of contact with charismatic recruiter or recruiters. This could be IRA, this could be somebody from ISIS or wherever it is Hizb ut-Tahrir or whoever. Second thing is that banning and prescribing these organizations in a liberal democratic society on its own does not work. The government has made some very, very serious mistakes. And one of the mistakes they're making is they'll say, well, here is an organization, we believe it to be extremist, we believe it to be violent, well, let's just ban it. Well, fine, ban it, but make it difficult for them to set up again. Secondly, one of the things that we're doing, and we have been doing for a while, and I've certainly been doing for the last 10 years, is actually trying to reintroduce some counter-narratives, trying to engage in some form of social activism to actually say, well, you know what, this is a problem that faces our society, both in the UK and a global society as well. And it's not something just for Muslims. It's only when people of faith and no faith, people who are Muslims, people who are not Muslims, come together and view this ideology in the same way that we might have viewed fascism in the 1930s or 40s, that we're actually going to be able to do something about it. So a lot of the things that we've been doing recently is building this liberal alliance, this liberal progressive alliance, and then actually providing counter narratives and actually providing some form of social activism to try and prevent people from Muslims from going down that pathway in the first place, and secondly, the ones that have, try and bring them back.
Okay, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I think in all of this, one of the things that really drives me insane are the liberals and the pro-Islamist left and the humanists, like the British Humanist Association, that will often see Sharia courts and the burqa as people's right to dress and people's right to religion, whereas it's definitely an encroachment on people's rights, an encroachment on it's a form of restriction and control, and it's pillars of the Islamist movement. There needs to be a concerted effort into seeing the various aspects of this movement as part of this movement, rather than seeing it as people's individual choices. It's not.
Absolutely. This is a chain, pieces in a chain of, Islamism sort of movements in Europe. The solution to stop the radicalization of the youth in Britain, actually to stop the Islamist schools and religious schools, to stop Sharia law in Britain, to stop funding these soft Islamist groups as thinking that they may, hopefully they won't plant bombs in Britain and get them engaged. You need to challenge them head on and support a civil society and individual rights and provide opportunity for everybody to participate in society. That's the real solution.
And I think it's this whole rotten multicultural standpoint which is the root cause, and which has allowed for these imams to be imported, to be funded, and to be allowed to brainwash or all of these people now who have gone and are fighting within ISIS. Their schooling was in those mosques and madrasas or whatever they call them, and by the promotion which we have promoted under Blair, and also they have continued in that. So it is this whole standpoint which must be questioned and put aside, and that's what we should challenge.
And you know, I'm fed up with them constantly talking about how they're concerned about what those people will do once they've come back from Syria and Iraq, as if they were radicalized there. They were radicalized right here.
Absolutely.
And it is the British government's responsibility. You know, they're stripping them of their passports. What does that mean? They want to not have them back here and make that someone else's problem? It's a British government's problem, and they've got to try to solve it.
What about 1,000 other young people who are going through the same process?
Yeah.
And we need to stop it now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we wonder what you think about this issue. These are all very important issues, and we look forward to hearing your point of view. Before we go, we have one more insane fatwa of the week. Now, a while back, I don't know if you heard this, but Sheikh Mohammed Monajid, he called Mickey Mouse one of Satan's soldiers. And he said that according to Islamic law, Mickey Mouse should be killed in all cases. Now, it's interesting because he was also a diplomat at the Saudi embassy. Well, we couldn't have expected anything less from him in Washington, D.C. And he made this remark on Arab TV. And he said that it's not only Mickey Mouse, it's also Jerry from Tom and Jerry, off with their heads. I think someone needs to tell him that they're not real, but they're so used to killing that they can't quite, see any boundaries or borders.
He has a lot of imaginary characters and imaginary friends.
Well, that's the end of our program. We hope you enjoyed our program, and until next week, we hope you have a wonderful week. Goodbye.